Could the NFL draft actually be the thing that's holding up the Jets-Packers Aaron Rodgers trade, plus the players who could make the Packers want to either stick and pick or move up? All of that on today's show.
You are Locked On Packers, your daily Green Bay Packers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Packers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Peter Bukowski, and I cover the Packers for The Leap, a newsletter I would love for you to subscribe to. Follow me on Twitter, Peter_Bukowski. Follow the podcast on Twitter, Locked On Packers. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to the podcast, iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts. Wherever you find podcasts, you will find Locked On Packers, the number one Packers podcast on the internet. And the show for fans who know what happened. They want to know why and how. Thanks to everyone who makes Locked On Packers their first listen every day. We hope you like starting your day with us as much as we like starting our day with you. So, I've been noodling over this. And one of the things that I have been thinking about when it comes to this Aaron Rodgers trade and why a deal is not already done is actually something we've been talking about on this show over the last few weeks as it relates to the Packers and the kinds of players that could be available at 15 and the thinness of this draft. And the way it was most recently reported from Diana Rossini and others is that the Packers would like to get this trade done by day one of the draft so that they can add players for Jordan Love. But also, the reason the Jets would like to hold on to 13 is because they feel strongly about adding an offensive line for the New York Jets. Let me just add one little addendum to all of this, and that is Ian Rappaport, for the second straight week, has gone on Pat McAfee and talked about this idea of setting a price, setting a value, and then cobbling picks together to meet that value. Last week, he was mentioning specifically 42 and 43 for the New York Jets. And then this week says, you know, I think it makes sense for these two teams to come to an agreement on value and then figure out what the trade looks like. This is, again, I think this idea of, okay, if the Packers think what they want is a first round pick and the Jets are saying 13 is off the table, then what does a trade look like if 13 is off the table? And for the Packers, it might be as simple as 42 and 43. And then you have the pick coming back. Ian Rappaport mentioned that he didn't think there were actually players in this trade, which if that's true, the Jets are just going to flat out cut Corey Davis and just say, okay, Packers, if we're going to play by your rules and you want all this value, then we're not putting Corey Davis in this trade. You're not allowed to negotiate with him exclusively. We are going to cut him, and if someone wants to overpay for him and not meet the price that you're willing to pay for him, then you will just have to deal with that. And I think if you're the Packers, you're going, fine. Now, if this conditional idea is true, and you look at this and you go, okay, who are the players the Jets are going to be sitting there at 13 and going, these are the guys we want? Peter Skoronski. If you look at the Athletic Consensus Board, Peter Skoronski. Now, not someone that I love. I had earlier, in this preseason or offseason process, talked about him as a potential Packers type. If you look at the relative athletic score and that kind of stuff, he is a Packers type. I'm getting through this offensive line class this week. I'm wearing purple right now for those of you who can see me on YouTube, and that's a Northwestern color, but this is not it for me. I don't think he's a top 15 player. I don't think he's a first round player. Is not going to have a first round grade for me. The arm issues, the length issues, the lateral quickness issues, I just don't see a player that I'm super stoked about at 15. Now, Paris Johnson Jr., love that. Broderick Jones from Georgia, love that. Paris Johnson Jr. from Ohio State. He's been one of those guys from the jump I identified as like, this is one of my dudes. And I mentioned this on Twitter yesterday that at 15, the guys that I'd be really stoked about, Paris Johnson Jr., Jackson Smith-Njigba, the Ohio State guys, Broderick Jones from Georgia, and Miles Murphy from Clemson. Those are the 4 guys that I think would really excite me if I were a Packers fan about. These are the guys the Packers could take about at 15, who can outplay their draft spot, who hit the kinds of athletic profiles that the Packers are looking for, all that stuff. That's important. So, those 3 guys, Paris Johnson Jr., Broderick Jones, Pete Skoronski, those are the 3 guys that I think if you're the Jets, you're going, okay, if our guys are here, if one of these guys makes it to 13, we are not giving up 13. So I think there is a reasonable scenario here where this trade gets done draft night and we wait actually, and then everyone agrees. Everyone's going to wait until we see what happens at 13. Now, I think that makes sense if the flip side of this is first round value. And I don't think, one of those seconds and a second that becomes a conditional first actually meets the criteria of a first round pick, especially if the Packers are sending conditional future picks back if Aaron Rodgers only plays a season. Those are not commensurate values. But let's say we get to 13 and those guys are off the board. Then I think the Jets become more willing to say, here's 13. Give us a 3rd round pick if Aaron Rodgers doesn't play past 2023, and we'll be good. And if you're the Packers, you go, cool, bet. Now, it may also be the case that when we get to 13, the Packers are not super stoked about that. That there's no one there that they love. That Miles Murphy off the board. Broderick Jones off the board. Paris Johnson Jr. and Jackson Smith-Njigba off the board. And then it's like, well, we don't really want 13. Like, you can always take 13 and then try and trade down if that's what you want to do. But if you're trading it, like very rarely is a team going to say, here's 13. Now, maybe in the top 10, all of a sudden, you just like lose all your guys. And then you have a couple picks and Joe Douglas is calling Brian Gutekunst and saying, look, if you want 13, you can have it. And Brian Gutekunst is like, we don't really want it. But Joe Douglas is like, well, we don't want to give you 42 and 43 because of the way this draft is breaking. Maybe you take that pick and say, okay, I can trade down and figure it out. Maybe that's the best value you can glean, or you just like stick and pick. Like, okay, you don't love the options and you just take one of these tight ends, or you just take Quentin Johnson Jr., Quentin Johnson, not Paris Johnson Jr. I don't think the Packers are going to do that, but they might. 2 first round picks, really valuable, really useful, really nice to have. This is something that I think you would hope you have ironed out before the draft. But now that we're here, it's April 11th. We're 2 weeks away from the NFL draft. In a way, I actually don't think it makes sense now to do this deal before we know who's on the board. Because if you're the Jets, you're going, well, yeah, we're willing to give up 13 because of the shape of the draft, something we've been talking about for weeks now. The meat of this draft is day 2. And so if I have 42 and 43, if I'm the Jets, if I'm advising Joe Douglas, there's part of me that's going, you want 13? If our guys are not there, it's like a trade down. Take that. Take 13, please. Oh my God, please take 13. Is that the way this is going to play out? We'll see, but I think there's a very real scenario now, and in fact, a smart scenario for both teams to wait until we see who's available at 13. The problem for the Packers is they might get into a situation where their best offer becomes 13 in a situation where they don't love the players there, and they do not have the time to trade out of that spot. There's no quarterbacks on the board. No one wants to come up. Will Levis has already been taken, for example. And you're going, well, we don't really want 13. We'd rather have 42 and 43. This is an interesting part of this scenario. And I wouldn't, as we have talked about leverage for weeks now, I don't know that there is leverage in a scenario like this because it is so dependent on the situation. Waiting until the moment these picks become available, maybe it breaks right for the Jets and they get to take Paris Johnson Jr. Or maybe it doesn't, and there's someone there the Packers love, and the Jets don't know that the Packers love them. And it becomes the ideal scenario for Green Bay. Or the Jets, we get to 13, and there's no one that the Packers love, but there's no one that the Jets love either. And so they're going, well, hey, listen, take 13. We'll take the third back in 2024, and no harm, no foul. Or 2025. You'd have to figure out how to couch it, because you can't have the 2024 draft pick, and then Aaron Rodgers like, you know what? I said I was going to retire, but I'm not going to retire. Like, you can't probably have that. So maybe it's 2025. But there is this very real scenario, and I think a scenario that makes sense for both sides, that allows them to wait until the last moment to see what they're getting before they decide, okay, a first or 2 seconds or whatever the rest of this package looks like. All right, more here in a second. But before we get there, today's episode brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Grand slams, no hitters, and double plays are back, and there's no better place to get in on the Major League Baseball action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's because new customers can step up to the plate for a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. Sign up, place your first bet, and get up to $1,000 back in bonus bets. So don't miss your chance to get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. So as I go through this offensive line class, there are, I think, some players that I really, really like for Green Bay. Paris Johnson Jr. from Ohio State is a guy that is just perfect for what Green Bay wants. Can play left tackle, can play right tackle. There's still so much upside for him. And he'd be a really good player right now, but I think can become even better, has Pro Bowl kind of potential. I'd be very surprised if he gets out of the top 10. Broderick Jones from Georgia. Really, really good player. I'd be surprised if he got to the Packers at 15, but you look around the boards that are out there on the internet, and he is not a unanimous kind of top 10, top 15 kind of player. Not ideally the kind of player the Packers have liked over the course of the last couple years, but you look at someone like Caleb Jones, 6'8", 350, 360, or whatever he is, and the Packers really seem to like him. And you see the incorporation of some power schemes, some gap schemes, and you go, I don't know, could a bigger guy, and he's actually weighs less than Paris Johnson Jr., but in terms of the things that he's good at, he maybe makes sense in an offense more geared around some power schemes. Okay, cool. That could make sense for the Packers. Someone like Darnell Wright, an offensive lineman at 15 that I think could be in the mix at 15 if the Packers are there. Anton Harrison from Oklahoma, another guy. Offensive line is the place at 15, I think, where there could be a slew of players that the Packers go, these guys are good. We really like them. And it's possible, okay, just draft them. Now in the second round, Matthew Bergeron, Cody Mauch, day 2, Blake Freeland, Jalen Duncan. Like, are these the guys that make you go, okay, well, should we pass? Like, I never think pass on these top guys because, you have the opportunity potentially later. But I think for the Packers, because they have Yosh Nijman, you're going, well, do they have to feel obligated here? Like, if at 15, the strongest part of this draft class is a position where you already feel strong, where David Bakhtiari is going to be your left tackle this year, Zach Thomas is going to be your left tackle next year, and you are willing to pay Yosh Nijman to be your right tackle of the future, or flip those guys, who cares? It doesn't matter. The difference between left tackle, right tackle at this point in the modern NFL is minuscule, so who cares? If you think those guys can be good players at those positions, that you don't have to draft those guys in those spots, now you have an opportunity to trade down. And I think that is really something the Packers are going to consider. So we talked about the trade down before, right? So you have this cohort of players. I think really, if you're not going to take an offensive lineman, so let's just assume, okay, they think David Bakhtiari this year is great, and maybe they're considering an extension. You have Yosh, who's still in his 20s. You have Zach Tom, who's going to be a rising sophomore in the NFL. You have Caleb Jones. You have Sean Ryan, who knows what he's going to be, but is converting to guard. Maybe you try him at tackle this season just to see what you have. And maybe you feel like, okay, at offensive line, we feel really good about what this team is. And actually, there are some other positions to address. Okay. So where can you get to if you want to get, let's say, and I don't just think, based on what I've been told, the Packers really like the top of this tight end class. In particular, Dalton Kincaid and Michael Mayer. And day 2, I think there are opportunities for them. Sam Laporta, Luke Musgrave, Darnell Washington. Certainly those guys are going to be appealing to the Packers. But I think right now, for the moment, if they had to pick, they'd be going, okay, we'd love to get one of these guys. Well, if you're sitting there at 15 and there's 3 offensive tackles that are really good and that other teams would potentially want, but you feel good about the combination of Bakhtiari, Nijman, and Tom, you're going, I don't know, pretty good position to be in. You want to come up Tampa Bay? Absolutely come up. You want to come up Baltimore? You want to come up Minnesota? You want to come up whoever these teams are. When you have 2 tight ends who you really feel like at 15, okay, Washington probably not going to take one. Pittsburgh, they just took one high. Probably not going to take one. Like Detroit at 18, they're a risk. But you have 2. Tampa Bay, they've got a couple tight ends on the roster that they probably feel good about. Seattle at 20, are they going to trade up for an offensive lineman? Probably not. They just drafted 2 really good ones. Baltimore, who knows what's going on with them and Lamar Jackson in their future, but maybe they do want to move up and add to this offensive line. They have a really good tight end, so maybe that's the perfect place. You move down to 22, the difference in trade value between Baltimore at 22 and the Packers at 15 is in that sort of It is by the Rich Hill trade chart in the 60s, which would be in that like third round pick kind of range. You know, if Baltimore gave you a third and a fifth to move down, you would do it. And then you have another pick in that third round range. Now, you could also get creative if you really wanted to. Baltimore does not have a second round pick because the Bears have it for Roquan Smith. So that makes this a little more complicated. But there are opportunities to trade down and potentially still get that tight end that you're looking for, precisely because this offensive line class is very good. And if the Packers are saying, hey, we feel good about this position, that gives them a lot of flexibility here moving forward. All right, we're going to finish up here, but before we do, today's episode is brought to you by the Ultimate Football GM. You've heard me talk about this mobile game app before, and if you ever thought you'd made a good GM, that you might be able to do better in negotiations with Joe Douglas than Brian Gutekunst has, then the Ultimate Football GM is your chance to get control and manage every strategic aspect of your team as you play through seasons and lead your team to glory, trying to build a historic dynasty. That means hiring the right coaches, managing all the finances, including negotiating players' salaries and terms, navigating your franchise through free agency, the draft, injuries, player personnel issues, and all the ups and downs of the season, all in a challenging and realistic game, World Football. Ultimate Football GM is completely free, playable offline, play as you go, as you want, whatever it is. And Locked On Packers listeners can get a 100% free boost to their franchise when you use the promo code Locked On in the game store. That's Locked On. So make sure to check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com to look it up in the App Store. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. And thanks for making Locked On Packers your first listen every day. Now make your second listen Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes. From free agency to the draft, salary cap management, and more, join NFL experts Kyle Crabb and Joe Marino as they take you through what it's like to build a successful NFL franchise every Monday through Friday. Find Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. Now, the flip side of the trade down is the trade up. And everything that I just said tells me if a player that the Packers would be interested in, the Darnell Wrights, the Paris Johnson Jr.'s, the Broderick Joneses of the world, if those are guys that they're very in on, you probably don't have to trade up for one of those guys if you think those guys are equal or close enough. Something that Jim Nagy pointed out, the Senior Bowl director, not Matt Nagy, Jim Nagy, is this receiver class is really tough. And there may only be one player in this group that everyone, or most people at least, have a first-round grade on, and that's Jackson Smith-Njigba. And to me, that screams, go up and get this guy. Not just because I think he's worth it, but I think he is. Because I think the drop-off from him to the next guy and the next guys, the next tier of guys and the next tiers of guys after that is incredibly significant. Now, I like Quentin Johnston more than I think the Packers will. In the same way that I like DK Metcalf more than I thought the Packers would. And this is not revisionist history. Go back and listen to the shows that I was doing in the pre-draft lead-up. That season, I was going, I think DK Metcalf is the perfect Matt LaFleur receiver. He's just not a Packers type with this front office. Quentin Johnston is not a DK kind of athlete because he's not a 4.3 kind of speed guy. But in terms of linear explosiveness, in terms of size, in terms of height, all that stuff, there are some similarities here. And even more if you look at play style. Like DK Metcalf is a big, strong guy. He's not I'm going to make, I'm going to moss guys. I'm going to go up over you DeAndre Hopkins style. Like the body says, I'm just going to overpower dudes. And that's not really the kind of player that he is. And that's the same as Quentin Johnston. if I'm the Packers, there is that one receiver that I love, absolutely love, and that's Jackson Smith-Njigba. Now, reports are, and from what I've heard, Jalen Hyatt is also on that list for Green Bay. I can't say that they would or would not take him at 15 because I don't know. I think they would prefer not to. I think they would prefer to get him in the 40s if they could. But it is interesting. They could find themselves in a position where they want to trade up for that guy. Back to the offensive line part of this, though, is if there's a bunch of those guys available, you could be looking at a team like Philadelphia or Tennessee even that says, look, there's 3 offensive linemen on the board at 11. We don't think the next 3 picks are all going to be offensive linemen. The Packers have assured us they're coming up for a receiver. We're going to trade back so that we can get one of those guys, but the Packers are going to move up and grab Jackson Smith-Njigba. This receiver class has me going, I think, move up. Now, I also think JSN is a top 10 kind of talent. Not everyone else believes that, but I do. So for the Packers, I think that is something that they could consider. This is all connected. That's the beauty of it. This is all connected, and I think it is something that we have to account for as we try and predict what is going to happen here moving forward. All right, more to come here on the Locked On Packers feed. Follow me on Twitter, Peter_Bukowski. Follow the podcast on Twitter, Locked On Packers. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to the podcast, iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you find podcasts, you will find Locked On Packers. Hey, our links on the Leap, for a little while, were getting flagged on Twitter. They're not getting flagged anymore. That was a whole, Elon thing. He didn't like that Substack was doing some stuff, and it doesn't matter. The moral of the story is they're not getting flagged anymore. Go check us out on Substack, theleap.substack.com. Go subscribe. We'd love to have you. Come hang out with us. I think that for someone who wants the day-to-day Packers stuff, there is not a better option out there to keep you updated with smart, interesting, compelling Packers content every single day delivered to your email address, theleap.substack.com. Check us out there. And anytime you want to hit us up on the Locked On Packers fan hotline, we don't really do that anymore. We don't really do the fan hotline anymore. But you can come hang out with us live. Ask your questions there. Ask your questions on Twitter, whatever you want. But ask your questions live on YouTube. Anytime big news is happening, we are going live on YouTube. We haven't had big news in a little while, ever since Aaron Rodgers declared himself a future New York Jet. But when this trade happens, we will be there so you can stay Locked On Packers.